We're considering and analyzing big drivers of disruption in the world of work, where disruption isn't always something to be afraid of. Disruption can bring lots of opportunities. One of them, of course, being technology, but many other drivers of disruption. I think that the examples of how we have disruption that comes with opportunities is best illustrated with technology, in that whereas before people had to work in a certain place at certain hours in a certain way, that's no longer the case. Technological advances mean that you can work anywhere. You can, as a firm, take more of your production process out to market or to another party in order to organize that way. I think it's bringing work into the reach of more people, people who might have had to stay at home for whatever reason because of home responsibilities, or they may have had some sort of physical impairment or disability that kept them from being able to work, are now able to work. So technology has allowed that to happen. It's also allowed more work to be observable. So because of advances in technology and advances in data, the amount of data that government has on people's actions, more work can be observed, and I think that it will be more and more difficult for employers or workers or a combination thereof to try to hide their work. Now, that's important for social insurance, because social insurance rests on the ability to be able to observe and administer information and resources. So I think that that's a great opportunity. Now, the disruption comes from the fact that more and more people are going to be working in ways that weren't imagined when social insurance law and social insurance policy was first conceived in many countries, particularly here in Latin America. The expectation was that we were all going to be working in factories or firms full-time for just one employer, that there would be this stability of the employee-employer relationship. And whether that was actually written down explicitly in the law, or whether it was just an assumption or an aspiration that policymakers held when they wrote the law, those assumptions really have shaped social insurance systems and created a rigidity that sometimes has caused stresses. It causes stresses when anyone who would prefer or needs to work in the non-standard way seeks to be covered. So if you are a young person who wants to combine work with study, and so you would like to work at less than full time, or if you are a parent who wants to combine work with parental responsibilities and therefore wants the flexibility, therein lies the stresses and the disruption to the standard employment model on which much of our social insurance apparatus was built. So yes, technology and other forces are creating lots of new opportunities, but they are also creating lots of stresses, because when we codified the systems, we didn't take account of just how much change would happen in the labor market. One of the biggest mistakes with the design of social insurance policy, which wasn't made, curiously enough, with the design of labor market regulation, is to codify very rigid parameters. And those parameters are, there are various parameters in any social insurance program. How much responsibility and risk is borne by the individual versus how much is shared in some sort of risk pooling dynamic. The contribution rate, the retirement age. All of these things in many countries are codified in the law in a manner that doesn't allow them to be shifted those parameters to be shifted as human beings and the way they live and the way they work, how long they live, how long they will need to continue working. As those things change quite organically, quite naturally, the parameters of the social insurance systems don't keep up. And the big problem, which we saw in many of the structural reforms to Social Security for old age in Latin America in the 1980s and 90s, was manifest because you had so many people who were reaching old age, and then once they reached old age, they were living longer thereafter. So what was once an uncertain risk or an uncertainty became a certainty, almost a certainty. But within the parameters of the system, there was no way to adjust the division of individual responsibility versus risk pooling in order to cover the risk of old age, the needs in old age. And that forced these very disruptive structural changes where you had to sort of change the whole system rather than just adjust the parameters. I think that the smart designs of social insurance are going to be those where most of the parameters are adjustable, either in regulation or less than full legislation, in order to give policymakers and the administrators of social insurance the ability to evolve and to be flexible to how people are working. That fluidity of how people work, how many jobs they're holding at the same time, when they are an employer themselves versus just a self-employed person, or they're working for someone else, or having all of those market statuses all at the same time, that's becoming more common. I think what's critical is to separate coverage from the most impoverishing losses from where and how people work. That's the critical thing. If coverage for the most important impoverishing losses is tied to where you work or how you work, then you're creating future vulnerability, given the fluidity of the labor market, the diversity of how people work today. So no longer can we count on the stability of the employee-employer relationship and the stability of the workplace on which to build and secure coverage for these most impoverishing losses. So that's the first step, is to identify what are the shocks and the accompanying losses to those shocks that can impoverish people, and to take those and to cover those with a system that pools risk at the level of the country. And that means financing from the broadest tax base. That might be general revenues, or it might be a earmarked tax that everyone pays. I think there's a nice discussion there, and there are benefits and costs to earmarking or not earmarking. But the point is to try to find the broadest based tax system, revenue instrument, and to use that as the financing mechanism in order to achieve the broadest possible risk pool, but for that core of protection. That's very, very different from the consumption smoothing function of social insurance. So the consumption smoothing function are the things that I do for myself. The government mandates me to do so in order to protect my future self from the myopia of my current self. And whether that is done with an individual savings account or an actuarially fair defined benefit system, I think we can be agnostic about that. What's important is that that is individualized, and because it's individualized, we can try to meet that function in a whole host of ways. Some which will still be in the traditional contribution collected by the employer, but more as a smaller contribution every time we go and we buy a cup of coffee with an electronic app. Or, their technology, again, opens up a whole host of possibilities for collecting the contributions that people would need to set aside in order to smooth their consumption between times when they're able to work to times when they no longer are able to work. I think that a lot can be done to even the playing field in the labor market without putting a tax on innovation. If you tax innovation, you're taxing a country's productivity potential. And in the long run, I think that will come back to bite any country by holding down in a form that's ad hoc and probably a bit artificial, holding down its productive potential. However, I think that there is much to be said for the arguments or the observations that the field of play is uneven, and that working people, if they're not already at a disadvantage, they might soon be at a disadvantage. But there are lots of things that one can do, particularly in the realm of macroeconomic policy, in order to try to even out that playing field without resorting to some sort of tax on innovation, which I think is a big mistake. For example, we've had years and years and years of near zero real interest rates. What that has done, in many ways it has been a lifeline to economies in the wake of the global financial crisis, but what that has done is that it has made investment in capital and machinery at the margin slightly more attractive than investing in labor. Another reality in many countries is that earnings from work are taxed at a relatively higher rate than earnings from other economic activities. The taxes on capital returns, taxes on land, immovable property, which is very puzzling since land is very difficult to hide from the state. It's notoriously undertaxed relative to how heavily the earnings from labor are taxed. So there are many things that one can do to level the playing field and to give workers a better opportunity to succeed and to find good jobs before we have to resort to a tax on innovation. I think that that's sort of the missing or the forgotten element of the liberal formula. And by liberal, I should probably also add progressive liberal formula, which was, economic deregulation and integration in world markets. Yes, there would be some losers, but overall, most people would win. That was the narrative, right? But the key part of the narrative that I think may have been forgotten was that we were supposed to compensate the losers. It's terrible to use that language, losers. We were supposed to compensate the people who were adversely affected from the liberalization that we all agreed was important in order to achieve higher levels of productivity and therefore higher levels of development and prosperity. And that compensation was supposed to take the form of assistance to help those people who had been displaced by trade liberalization, who are being displaced by technological adoption and automation, to retrain them, redeploy them, and reinsert them into good jobs. That takes more money, more effort, and more patience than many policymakers were prepared to give. And that was a big mistake. And I think that we are seeing with the rise of populism, we are seeing with the backlash against the progressive liberal agenda, the consequences of forgetting that part of the formula. And I think critically for your membership, as they think about themselves as the custodians of the social insurance institutions of their countries, I think that it's important to realize that the definition of social insurance as contribution-based, where contribution is also defined quite narrowly to mean a statutory contribution from the employee and the employer and sometimes government. If that's the definition of social insurance, and if that cannot change, I don't think social insurance has a future. However, if the definition can go away from these second-order administrative structures and financing structures and more toward the objectives, which is to help people to manage shocks and losses that private markets won't ever insure. If we hold that to be the definition of social insurance, then social insurance has a bright, bright future.